I'm 64 years old and I spent 31 years as a high school history teacher in Dayton, Ohio. I retired early, not because I wanted to, but because my knees gave out and the school board offered a package I couldn't turn down. My first wife, Carol, passed away from ovarian cancer in the spring of 2021. We'd been married for 28 years. After she died, I moved through the house like a ghost. I'd make coffee in the morning and pour 2 cups out of habit, then stand there looking at the second one until it went cold. I wasn't looking for anyone. I want to be clear about that. My daughter, Naomi, had been pushing me to go to her church's community dinners since the fall of 2022, mostly because she was worried I was spending too much time alone. I went twice, didn't enjoy either time, and then went a third time because she drove to my house and sat in my driveway until I agreed to come out. That third dinner was in January of 2023. That's where I met Sylvia. She was sitting at the far end of the table laughing at something the woman next to her had said. She had this way of laughing. She covered her mouth with 2 fingers, like she was trying to hold it in. I noticed it because Carol used to do the same thing. I thought it was a coincidence. I thought a lot of things were coincidences back then. We talked for almost 2 hours that night. She told me she was a retired nurse from Springfield, that she'd moved to Dayton about a year ago to be closer to her sister after a difficult divorce. She was 57. She'd never had children. She had warm eyes and she asked good questions and she remembered everything I said, which is the kind of thing you notice when you've been alone for 2 years. Naomi didn't like her from the beginning. She was never rude about it. My daughter isn't built that way, but she was quiet in a way that meant something. The first time I introduced them, Naomi smiled and shook Sylvia's hand and said, "It's nice to meet you," and then didn't say much else for the rest of the afternoon. On the drive home, she texted me, "She seems nice, Dad. Just take your time, okay?" I told myself Naomi was being protective, that it was natural, that losing her mother had made her hold on tighter to the people she still had. Sylvia and I were married in August of 2023, 7 months after that community dinner. I know how that sounds. I knew how it sounded then, too. And I told myself it didn't matter, because Carol and I had known each other for 3 weeks before I asked her to dinner, and 28 years later we were still reaching for each other's hands at the movies. Sometimes you just know, I thought. Sometimes the math doesn't matter. The morning everything changed started like 100 other mornings. Sylvia had a routine dental appointment, just a cleaning and some x-rays she'd been putting off since before we got married. The practice was on Far Hills Avenue, a place called Ridgeline Family Dental. I drove her because the appointment was early and she'd mentioned her shoulder had been bothering her from what she called an old injury. Some fall she'd taken a couple of years back. I didn't think anything of it. I sat in the waiting room with a Field and Stream magazine I wasn't reading and half listened to the morning news on the television mounted in the corner. She'd been back there for maybe 40 minutes when a woman in scrubs came out and asked if I was Sylvia's husband. I said I was. She introduced herself as Dr. Aldridge. She didn't smile when she said it. She asked if we could speak privately. There was a small office near the back, past the rooms with the chairs and the overhead lights. She closed the door and sat down across from me and folded her hands on the desk and said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." I said, "Of course." She said, "When we take jaw x-rays, we also capture a significant portion of the surrounding skull structure. That's standard. What I'm seeing in your wife's images is a pattern of healed fractures, not one, not two, but what appears to be multiple separate injuries at different stages of healing. Some old, some more recent." She paused. "Has your wife been in accidents?" I said that she'd mentioned a fall, that her shoulder gave her trouble sometimes. Dr. Aldridge looked at me in a way that I can only describe as careful. "How many falls has she had, to your knowledge?" I thought about it. There was the shoulder. She'd mentioned a car accident before we met, something on I-70 years ago. She'd had a scar on her forearm she said was from a kitchen incident. I counted in my head and said, maybe 4 or 5 that I know of. Could be more before we met. She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the phone on her desk and said, "I'm going to need to make a call." I didn't understand at first. I thought she meant to a specialist or maybe to Sylvia's primary care physician. When the receptionist appeared in the doorway and asked Dr. Aldridge, if she should call the front desk back first, and Dr. Aldridge said, "No, call the non-emergency line." That's when I felt something drop in my chest. Not fear exactly. More like recognition. The feeling you get when you've been wrong about something important for a long time and your body understands it before your mind does. They asked me to wait in a separate room from Sylvia. I sat in a chair next to a poster about flossing and I looked at my hands and tried to think clearly. A police officer arrived within 20 minutes. A woman, mid-40s, in a gray sweater and slacks, plainclothes. She introduced herself as Detective Fossey from the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office. She asked if I would come down to the station to talk. Not my wife. Me. At the station, Detective Foss sat across from me at a plain table in a plain room and walked me through a list of questions that took about 90 minutes. Had Sylvia ever shown signs of cognitive confusion? Had I ever seen her take medication that hadn't been prescribed? Had I noticed changes in my own health since we got married? Fatigue, stomach issues, unexplained weight loss? That last question stopped me cold. I had lost weight. About 14 pounds since October, which I had chalked up to stress and the fact that I'd been eating less since Sylvia started cooking most of our meals. I had been tired in a way that felt different from ordinary tired, a deep, bottom-of-the-well tired that I'd mentioned to my own doctor in November, who ordered blood work and told me my iron was low and suggested I take a supplement. I'd done that and felt marginally better and hadn't thought much more about it. Detective Foss wrote something down and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "We've run a background check on Sylvia." She slid a piece of paper across the table. Her name before your marriage wasn't Sylvia Beaumont. She changed it legally in 2018. Before that, she was Sylvia Darnell, and before that, she was Sylvia Kowalski. She gave me a moment to read. She's been married 4 times, Mr. Whitmore. You're the 4th. I looked at the paper and I didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. The first husband died in 2009, ruled a heart attack. He was 61. The second husband was in a serious car accident in 2013 that left him with a traumatic brain injury. He's in a care facility in Cleveland. The third husband, the one she told you she divorced, died in 2020, ruled an accidental fall down a flight of stairs. He was 67. She said they had been looking at Sylvia for 2 years in connection with the third husband's death, that the investigation had stalled because there wasn't enough physical evidence, and because Sylvia had moved and changed her name again, and they'd lost the trail. A financial crimes unit had been building a separate case around multiple fraudulent insurance claims tied to each of the accidents and deaths. I sat in that chair and thought about the morning I poured 2 cups of coffee out of habit. I thought about how I had moved through that house like a ghost, and how lonely it was, and how the loneliness had made me grateful for anyone who asked good questions and remembered what I said. I've thought about how easy it is when you are 64 years old and you have just buried the person who made you feel solid in the world. To convince yourself that you know the difference between something real and something that only looks like it. I didn't go home that night. Detective Fossey had the house treated as a potential scene and asked me to stay somewhere else for a few days. I called Naomi from the parking lot of the police station. She picked up on the second ring. I said her name and then I couldn't find the next words. She was quiet for a second and then she said, "Dad, where are you right now?" I told her. She said, "Stay there. I'm coming." While I waited for her in that parking lot, I sat in my car and thought about every conversation Naomi had ever tried to have with me about Sylvia, that I'd deflected or dismissed or rationalized away. The time she called me on a Sunday morning and asked very gently whether I knew if Sylvia had a doctor she saw regularly, because she'd noticed Sylvia never seemed to make or receive any medical appointments. The time she asked me after Sylvia's shoulder was bothering her particularly badly, "Has she ever been evaluated for that? Like, properly evaluated?" And I had said, in the voice of a man who thought he was being reasonable, that Sylvia didn't like doctors much and that I respected that. I thought about the fact that my own blood work had come back flagged, that I had been tired in a way I couldn't explain, that for the past several months, Sylvia had been the one to make my morning coffee and bring it to me in the living room while I read, because she said she liked doing it. I'd thought that was tenderness. I'd let myself believe that was tenderness. When Naomi pulled into the parking lot and got out of her car and walked toward me, she looked exactly like her mother. She didn't say anything. She just put her arms around me and held on. And I let her, which is something I don't do easily because I was raised by a man who believed that holding on was the same as falling apart. The investigation took about 8 months. I was asked to cooperate, which I did completely. I submitted to additional blood work, comprehensive toxicology this time, and the results showed traces of a compound, a sodium compound found in certain medications and available in concentrated form that had been present in elevated levels in my system for an undetermined period, enough to cause fatigue, digestive disruption, and over time, cardiac stress. The doctors said the timeline, based on the level of accumulation, was probably 6 to 9 months. Roughly from the autumn after we married. I won't go into every detail of what followed because some of it is still part of the public record and some of it belongs to the families of the other men she married. What I will say is this: the insurance fraud case was significant. Across all 4 marriages, the estimated total in fraudulent claims, life insurance payouts, disability claims, accidental injury policies, was somewhere above $2.1 million. She had been doing this for nearly 20 years. The healed fractures on her skull, the ones that had made Dr. Tenterate Aldridge pick up that phone, were self-inflicted. That's what the forensic specialist concluded. It's not common, but it happens in cases of long-running insurance fraud, staged falls, fabricated accidents, injuries that leave a person in enough legitimate pain to be credible. She had been doing it to herself, calmly and repeatedly, for a very long time. That was the detail that I couldn't shake afterward. Not what she had done to me or to the others. The ones she had done to herself. I have a theory about why, though I'm not a psychologist and no one has asked for my theory. I think that when you build a life around deceiving people, you eventually lose track of where the performance ends. I think she may have hurt herself so many times that the pain had become the only thing she trusted to be real. Or maybe I'm looking for a way to understand something that doesn't have an explanation. Maybe that's just what grief does. It keeps searching for a door, even in the walls. I moved out of the Far Hills house in early 2024. I sold it without going back inside more than twice. I let a real estate agent handle the staging and the showings, and I signed the papers at a title company on a Tuesday afternoon while it was raining, and I drove straight from there to Naomi's house and sat at her kitchen table while she made chicken soup, and we watched her kids do homework at the other end of the table. I am living now in a smaller house in Yellow Springs, about a 40-minute drive from Naomi. It has a front porch with 2 chairs which I use most mornings when the weather allows. I make 1 cup of coffee. That took longer to change than I expected. The muscle memory of a thing can outlast the reason for it. I started seeing a therapist in March of 2024. Her name is Dr. Callahan, and she has a very direct way of asking questions that I find useful. She told me once that what happened to me was not a failure of intelligence. That predatory behavior of this kind works precisely because it targets the places where people are most human. Their grief, their longing, their willingness to believe that the world still has good things to offer. She said that being open to love after loss is not stupidity. That mistaking a calculated performance for genuine warmth doesn't mean the warmth wasn't real inside of me. I've thought about that a lot. Naomi came out to Yellow Springs 2 weeks ago, and we sat on the front porch for most of a Saturday afternoon. She brought a peach cobbler she'd made from scratch, which she knows is the only dessert I have ever actually cared about. At some point, she said without looking at me, "I should have pushed harder." I told her she had pushed hard enough, and I had been the one not listening. We let that sit between us for a while without trying to resolve it into something neater than it was. She asked me eventually if I had any regrets about marrying her. I thought about it honestly. I said that I regretted the harm that came to the other men, that I regretted not listening to her sooner, that I regretted the months of my life that were quietly being taken from me while I sat in my living room thinking I had finally found something good. But I said, I don't regret that I was still capable of that, of wanting something, of being willing to sit at a table with a stranger and let her make me laugh. Whatever Sylvia was, whatever she didn't take that from me. I still had it. I was still the man who could walk across a room and sit down and try. Naomi didn't say anything. She leaned her head against my shoulder the way she used to when she was 8 years old, and we were watching something on television that she wasn't quite old enough for, but that I let her stay up to see anyway because Carol said we were too lenient, and she was probably right. But some nights, it's worth it. I am still here. The porch has 2 chairs, and I only need one, but I don't plan to take the other one away. I don't know what comes next, but I've stopped being afraid of the question. If this story reached you, and something about it sits with you in a way that's hard to name, you're not alone in that. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if something in your own life feels off in a way you can't explain yet, trust that feeling. I didn't. I wish I had, but I'm still here, and that's not nothing. I've thought a lot about what it means to be a careful person. I taught history for 31 years. I spent my career showing teenagers how patterns repeat themselves, how the same mistakes get made generation after generation, not because people are stupid, but because they want things badly enough to stop looking clearly. I knew that. I taught that. Then I sat across from a woman at a church dinner, and I wanted something, and I stopped looking. That's not self-pity. That's just the truth about how it works. What happened to me didn't happen because I was weak or foolish. It happened because Sylvia was skilled at finding the exact shape of a person's longing and filling it precisely. She watched how I talked about Carol. She noticed what made me quiet and what made me light up. She filed all of it away and used it carefully, the way you'd use a tool. That kind of calculation doesn't defeat intelligence. It works around it. It goes in through a different door. But here's what I've had to sit with. The door was open because I let it be, not because I was grieving. Grief isn't a character flaw, but because I stopped listening to the people around me who were paying attention when I wouldn't. Naomi told me, in her careful way, more than once. She never said the words directly, but she said them in every other way a person can say something. And I heard her and chose not to hear her, because hearing her meant reconsidering something I didn't want to reconsider. That's the part that cost me the most even now. Not what Sylvia did. What I didn't do. There's a version of this story where I stay angry at her, where I let what she was define how I see the time we had. I've tried that version. It doesn't hold up. Anger at someone who is never who you thought they were is like being angry at a door for not being a window. It exhausts you without changing anything. What I've come to instead is something harder and more useful: accountability without collapse. I made choices. Some of them were wrong. I can look at that clearly now. What I ignored, what I rationalized, what I let go on longer than it should have. And I don't have to destroy myself over it. I just have to learn it. Actually learn it. The way you learn something you intend to carry forward, not the way you learn something you plan to forget. Dr. Aldridge didn't look away. She saw something in an X-ray that most people wouldn't have known to question. And she made a phone call that probably saved my life. I think about her more than she'd expect, because what she did was a version of what I should have done when Naomi covered her mouth with her hand instead of laughing and when quiet at dinner. I should have looked at that the way a good doctor looks at an X-ray, not for what I wanted to see, but for what was actually there. Naomi was the one who drove to that parking lot and put her arms around me and said nothing, because she understood that nothing was exactly the right thing to say. She's been doing that her whole life, reading a room, reading a person, staying steady when the people around her aren't. I gave her that, I think. Carol and I gave her that together, and it came back to me at the exact moment I needed it most. I don't know what the rest of my life looks like. I'm 64. I have a porch and a cup of coffee and a daughter 40 minutes away and a therapist who asks good questions. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. What I want to say to anyone who's sitting somewhere right now, alone with a feeling they can't quite name, trust it. Not blindly, not in a way that closes you off from everything. But trust it enough to ask the question. Trust the people who love you enough to actually hear what they're telling you, even when it's inconvenient, even when it cost you something you wanted. Wisdom isn't about being smarter than the people trying to deceive you. It's about being honest enough with yourself to see what you're wanting is hiding from you. That's the thing I'm still learning. I expect I'll be learning it for the rest of my life, and I'm okay with that.